So I'm really excited to learn from your experience in water law and policy, and I hope it can better and refine and refine our own technical report that we've been working on, and that it can help broaden our perspectives. And given your background as the Richard Morrison Professor of Water Law at ASU, and your role as a senior research fellow at the Kyla Center for Water Policy, your perspective on integrating sustainable practices within Arizona's growing clean hydrogen economy is just invaluable. So I'm going to be basing a lot of the questions off of insights you've made in your book, Just Add Water, where you note that the water security paradigm should be led by regionalists through local partnerships between informed water users that understand the unique economic and cultural and ecological conditions. And you state that top-down hierarchical governance is often ineffective because it's too removed from actual policy implementation to understand community organization and responses to social problems. So this perspective was a major part of my master's study program here at ASU. I was in the GTD program. And similarly, AZ Kane seeks to inform policy and engage regional stakeholders to ensure that implementations are in line with local needs and conditions. So while you work at the global and the local scales, AZ Kane's mandate is primarily on the state of Arizona and its surrounding states. So my questions are going to be on a more regional level. So as we explore the role of clean hydrogen in contributing to a carbon neutral economy, I'd love to discuss both the potential and the challenges regarding water rights, laws, and policies, especially with regards to how hydrogen production might unfold in Arizona. I'm eager to hear your thoughts about how Arizona is gearing up for these changes, especially from a legal perspective on water rights and management. So first question. So in the introduction to your book, Just Add Water, you suggest that water could be the answer to various social policy questions. You argue that global water security and ensuring reasonable access to water of acceptable quality and quantity could be the first step to solving what you say are wicked problems like terrorism, racism, climate change, and global pandemics. And you state that a water-secure society is a safer, fairer, healthier, and a more prosperous society. So as someone who has long worried about the future of water security in a world increasingly affected by climate change, I find myself in complete agreement with this statement. And I'd love if you could elaborate why you believe water is the key to solving these complex issues.
Well, as I sort of begin my book talking about my experience working in hurricane response is what really opened my eyes. I'm from Arizona. I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, so I've always been acutely aware of the central importance of water, but I don't know that I fully appreciated how much it affects every aspect of life until in the wake of hurricane disaster response, I realized that every other problem that deals with hurricane response was easier to solve if you just solved the water problem. So if you could get rid of the dirty water and get everyone enough clean water to drink, every other problem, housing, public health, security, they all improved. And the more I've studied water, the more I realize that there is an underappreciated hydro component of virtually every problem on the face of the earth. And I don't want to make it sound like, oh, well, if everybody got clean water, racism would disappear. I don't believe that. But I do think you'd be surprised at how much we address racial disparities by improving water security. I think people would be stunned to realize, oh, wow, like there's a major aspect in racism and sexism that is centered in water. And if we fixed that problem, turns out racism and sexism would be easier to solve. I feel the same way about armed conflict, terrorism, poverty, religious tolerance. All of these things have a water component that if we just solved that or improved it, we might be surprised how many problems that seem like they have nothing to do with water all of a sudden become a lot more manageable.
Just a very small part of that is just, I know in many countries, women are expected to be the water fetchers, and that can take up to 8 hours of their day. So that's an aspect, if that's addressed, can address both water scarcity and feminism and gender disparity. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a fantastic point, that it's not the be all end all cure all solution, but it is all connected, and solving one can help solve others.
And I've always been a big believer. I've been working on an idea. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to call it. I'm thinking about calling it flushed or poop, pee, and periods, which is there are these sort of taboo topics that we flush away, that we don't want to talk about. And we have to do a better job of bringing them into the center of our conversation so that we're not ashamed as a society to talk about poop, pee, and periods. That if we learn how to speak about those things without shame and in ways that are frank and honest, then there's a whole variety of problems, including educational and economic opportunities for women, that will just be improved if we don't cringe every time we bring up these taboo topics. And these taboo topics are often, they're centered on water, hygiene, sanitation.
Absolutely. This is a little bit of a side, but for coming from a Hindu country, Nepal, during a woman's period, in more religious circles, she would be seen as unclean. She would be sent to another area. You wouldn't be allowed to touch her. Things like that, and that causes disruption in girls' education. It causes disruption in girls' hygiene because they're not able to get proper sanitation, and it's just unbelievable. So I absolutely agree that this is a multifaceted issue that and I do wish we would talk more about this aside. So I'm looking forward to your work on that. So building on your statement that a water secure society is fairer and healthier, how can water policies be designed to ensure equitable access to water for Arizonans?
Well, I suppose the first part of my answer there would be we need to distinguish between intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. So intergenerational equity is sustainability. Are we making sure that our children and our grandchildren are being treated fairly in our water policy decisions? And that is about making sure that we're leaving them groundwater so that they get to make their own decision about groundwater. We don't make it for them. So that, I think, is a matter of, are we ensuring that we're not depleting non-renewable resources in the way that we're structuring our water governance systems? Then there's intragenerational equity, which is making sure that we're treating one another right now fairly. And I think part of that begins with a recognition that we are all beneficiaries. First of all, from an intergenerational equity perspective, we're beneficiaries of our grandparents and great-grandparents' wise decisions. We've had, and this goes back all the way to, we are beneficiaries of the traditions of Native Arizonans who have been here for time immemorial. They have made wise decisions that allow us to live here. And it goes back to my parents and grandparents who made wise decisions like the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. So are we taking the lessons that we've learned from our ancestors, and are we building on them and passing those lessons on? And are we learning from their mistakes as well? But the other thing I wish people would recognize for purposes of intragenerational equity is the extent to which we are, or many of us are, beneficiaries of a system that has built large, expensive infrastructure projects that have allowed us to have the lifestyle that we have, and that we can't fairly, in my opinion, cut off those kind of investments that are needed for our own neighbors. And I think the thing I'd like to point out that I think has happened recently is think about the challenge surrounding the Rio Verde foothills issues in Arizona, which is what happens when a group of people who have, large fancy houses just north of Scottsdale, when they run out of water, we all panicked, and there was an enormous amount of bipartisan political will to solve the problem of a group of people with big, nice houses living right outside of Scottsdale. And a lot of the language at that time was, well, Arizona's not a third world country, and we can't allow Arizonans to live like this. But yet we've allowed many Arizonans to live like this for decades. And those are many of our tribal neighbors, and they are many of our neighbors along the border who live in colonias. And so we have to find the same political will to help our neighbors who live in Indian country and along the borders as we found to help our neighbors in the Rio Verde foothills region. I agree, Arizonans should not live without a clean, sustainable, affordable water supply. But you have to ask yourself, why did we freak out and find a solution so quickly for people living right outside of Scottsdale? But we sat around for generations not trying to find the same solutions for people who are living in the Navajo Nation or living in Colonias along the border. I think every Arizona needs to be treated with that same level of urgency and willingness to invest.
Thank you. That's definitely something that I think we all know the answer as to why. And,
exactly.
We all know that we know, and it is unacceptable. And I'm glad that you brought some attention to that. In your chapter titled Water Security and Technological Innovation, what are some specific technologies you think are essential for integrating water rights and policies with clean hydrogen production?
Well, first, I would say that we need to split these technological innovations into categories. There's innovation in water conservation, in water storage, in water treatment and transport, and in augmentation. Energy innovations are relevant to every single one of these aspects. So we can't, there's and I'm sure you know this, the idea of the water, food, energy nexus, which is you can't really talk about one area without talking about the others. Water's very heavy to move. And when it's dirty, it's expensive to treat. And that expense is largely about energy. So any energy innovation is relevant to water policy. It's relevant to water policy and our ability to affordably treat water to make it clean and affordably move water from one place to another. And making a sort of lower carbon or zero carbon energy transition is important to water because the principal challenge of climate change is water variability. The way that people will experience climate change, principally in their lives, is not in the temperature of the air, even though that will be worse. The main way people will experience climate change and the costs of it are in water variability, droughts, floods. That's how they're going to experience it. And so anything we can do to mitigate the effects of climate change by moving towards a lower carbon or no carbon energy future is going to help us manage water better. So energy innovations are a part of every aspect of water. But what are some specific innovations? If we get better with water conservation, it's going to free up more water for things like green hydrogen production. So I think about moving us towards photovoltaics. So we're putting more solar energy panels on top of our water storage systems and on top of our water conveyance systems. I do think moving towards biosynthetic membranes in irrigation. So we've come a long way in improving our irrigation, moving towards, end drip production, using more drip irrigation, more center pivot. But we can do more, which is biosynthetic membranes. This is moving water through membranous tubes that respond to growth hormones in the soil. So they only release water when the plants ask for it. So if we move to that level of efficiency in our crop production, then it's going to free up more water for things like energy production in green hydrogen. And I am a believer in the future of water augmentation technologies, in particular desalination. But the main challenge there is going to be, can we get sustainable green energy production to facilitate desalination? And desalination, I think, will be a part of our future. But it's only going to be a part of our future if we find ways to make it energy efficient. And that's going to require integration with photovoltaic solar cells and with hydrogen production. And it's going to require energy transfer systems that will allow us to recycle pressure from the waste stream into the production stream, allowing us to co-locate our desalination plants with energy generation and with wastewater disposal. So those are the sort of innovations I think that are going to free up water for the kinds of energy innovations we're going to also need.
Yeah, absolutely. Arizona is sitting on a massive amount of brackish water that currently is not able, it's not logistically feasible to be able to use that for desalination purposes. But if it was in the future, that could definitely be a source. What are the environmental and legal considerations that need to be addressed when implementing water augmentation technologies for hydrogen production?
Well, hydrogen production in the context of water augmentation is no different than any other water user in the sense that it has a water demand and it might be willing to pay for it. The only real difference with hydrogen production is that the relative costs and benefits of hydrogen production might be different than the relative costs and benefits of additional housing or growing more alfalfa, meaning that more green hydrogen production would mitigate climate change. And so the relative costs and benefits are a little bit different. But building more houses is really important. We have a housing affordability crisis in Arizona, and people want to move here for a lot of understandable reasons. We need to build more houses, and more houses demand more water. So the costs and benefits are a little bit different when talking about green hydrogen, but it's still just another water user that we have to evaluate. So the real question is, in water augmentation and desalination, it is, first of all, can we afford it? Even the best desalination plants in the world right now might be producing a single acre foot of clean water at, let's say, conservatively or optimistically, $2,000 an acre foot. $2,000 an acre foot, no farmer is going to farm on $2,000 an acre foot. But it's possible that hydrogen producers could economically produce hydrogen at $2,000 an acre foot. It's possible that housing developers would build houses at $2,000 an acre foot. So the real question there is the economics of it, is who's willing to pay that amount of money for that quantity of water. What are the legal and policy considerations? I mean, where are you going to build the desal plant? Are you going to build it in California? Then that's a challenge because we already struggle to get along with our neighbor to the west. Are you going to build it in Mexico? That's a challenge as well, because as much as we might struggle to get along with California, hydrodiplomatically, we're more closely aligned with Mexico than with California, but our laws and governance regimes aren't quite as integrated. So it's going to take more careful diplomatic negotiations, and Mexico's very understandably going to go, what's in it for us? But I do think that Mexico is going to be moving towards more desalination with or without us. They're going to build more desalination plants in resort communities like Puerto Peñasco. It would be foolish of us to not have a conversation with our neighbors to the south in Sonora and say, if you're going to do this anyway, what can we do to help you? And what might it do to benefit us? If we can expand the capacity of a desal plant in Puerto Peñasco, use some of the sort of waste stream from that as a dust suppression component in the Salton Sea, and then Mexico, if we support the desal plant, they give up some portion of their water that we can then move through their Colorado River right, that we can then move through the Central Arizona Project. There are creative ways that we might be able to see this as a win-win-win in the lower basin. So I do think that happens, and for industries that are interested in getting their hands on that water, they're going to have to be a part of that conversation, and that includes green hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I've done a lot of research on Arizona's ancient Native American civilizations, with a chapter in our technical report dedicated to the incredibly advanced water management strategies and developments that they accomplished, many of which remain to this day, such as the Central Arizona Project, based on irrigation systems by the Huhucam. Drawing from historical and cultural context, what is your take on how ancient water management practices can inform modern policies aimed at achieving water security?
I think that we owe a debt of gratitude to the Hohokam people for everything that they taught and left future civilizations in the Salt River Valley. These are some of the most brilliant engineers in human history, but they are just as much a cautionary tale as they are a tale of success. There's a lot of different ways and spellings that you can translate Hohokam, but under the O'odham language, it's roughly translated into perished, or all used up, or those who are gone. And I think we have to take what they did as a lesson of how fragile any civilization is in this valley. And I think it's easy to look back and give a simple explanation for, oh, well, they were a great water civilization, and then there was a drought, and that's why that civilization fell. But that's not an accurate depiction of what happened. What happened is we have really salty water, and if we keep putting salty water on our soil and we don't have a salt management system, then salt will build up in our soil and we won't be able to continue to grow the crops that we're growing. And that was a challenge they faced. Also, flooding was just as much a problem for them as drought was. floods were continually damaging and silting up their canals. And so water variability was what pushed them. And that they ended up having to adapt. So even though the sort of great civilization of the Hohokam didn't persist for a whole bunch of social and technical reasons, the Peepash and the Acamel people are still here, right? Which means it's a story of adaptation, and that sometimes we make decisions that seemed really smart at the time, and then those decisions over the long run end up not being the right long-term management strategy. And then we adapt and persist. And the reality is that water scarcity in the desert is not a problem that you solve. It is a challenge that you manage. It will never go away. And so every decision that we make in due time will show its weaknesses. We will never make a perfect decision. And after generations, we're going to look back and go, oh, that was a pretty good decision at the time. Turns out it's not really working for us anymore. And we're going to have to adapt. We're seeing that right now with the Groundwater Management Act. It was a brilliant piece of legislation in 1980, but we made some mistakes, and we're going to have to fix those mistakes. So for me, the lesson of this great civilization is technology can only take you so far. Brilliant engineering can only take you so far. You're going to have to adapt in order to survive.
Okay. That's definitely very good advice, and it's definitely very relevant to Arizona, especially what you said with how deserts, you will never have enough water. You just have to adapt to that. You're not. So that's definitely a good point. And that's something that Dr. Catherine Sorensen has also said in previous interviews as well. That we never had the luxury of not being extremely careful with our water. Right. So Phoenix has had this baked into them since its inception, unlike many other cities that are only just now starting to try to grapple with long-term water considerations. So in your book chapter, Water Security and Climate Change, you discuss how well-intentioned regulatory measures aimed at addressing climate change, such as emission standards on coal-fired power plants, can inadvertently affect water supplies for Indian country. This was seen when increased power costs of the now closed Navajo generating station impacted the Central Arizona Project's ability to deliver water to those tribal nations legally entitled to it. Can you discuss ways that clean hydrogen production could possibly impact Indian country and how those impacts could be mitigated through legal precedents?
Well, I think green hydrogen production has the potential to revolutionize energy production and generation in Indian country. I think Governor Lewis of the Gila River Indian community has been supportive of green hydrogen developments and sees it as a potential for mitigating climate change, ensuring energy security, and also generating jobs for his people. And he's been, I think, one of the most forward-thinking, innovative water leaders that we've had in the West. With that said, it's a major water consumer. There's just no getting away from the reality that hydrogen production is going to consume a whole bunch of water. It's going to consume a whole bunch of water, just like quantum computing is, just like microchip and semiconductor production is, just like agriculture and housing already does. So it's a new competitor in the water market that's going to have to be accounted for. And it's going to create challenges and opportunities for tribes, because the tribes, generally speaking, have very high priority water rights. And as you're seeing with new legislation and agreements coming out for the Navajo Nation, for the Hopi, for the San Juan Paiute, with major developments now in a settlement negotiation with the Yavapai Apache Nation, you're seeing new opportunities with recent bills for the Colorado River Indian tribes to market their water rights off of reservation. You're seeing new economic opportunities for these high priority water rights to be conveyed to new water users. And so as green hydrogen steps up as a new competitor, it's going to put new demands and new opportunities on tribes that can lease their water rights off reservation. Now, if green hydrogen is pumping a bunch of groundwater to produce hydrogen, they're probably, in at least many instances, going to want a recharge source. And that recharge source is going to be a renewable source. And nobody's got higher priority renewable sources than the tribes. So it's going to create new economic opportunities for the tribes to market their water rights off reservation, but it's going to create new cultural and political challenges, because are the tribes going to want to sell their water to, or lease their water to, green hydrogen, or to cattlemen, or to real estate developers, or to cities? And so it's going to create, and are they going to want to put it off reservation in any event? Are they going to want to use that water for economic development on their own land? And so it's going to create hard discussions and new economic opportunities.
Thank you for going into detail with that. That's really enlightening. You also discussed the importance of water footprints in quantifying water use and pollution across the entire production chain. Similar to carbon footprints, you argue that water footprints make sustainability issues more understandable and relatable to the public by focusing on local water availability, variability, and extreme weather events. How can water footprint metrics be used to better engage and educate the public and industries about the importance of sustainable water use in energy?
Well, I would say that green hydrogen is probably the perfect example of why water footprints are better than carbon footprints as a metric for understanding sustainability. Because green hydrogen, at least in the way that it's sort of conceived, is a virtually carbon neutral energy production mechanism. So assuming you're doing, assuming you're using solar arrays for all of the electrolysis that's doing the actual splitting of the water, and once you're using the hydrogen, your only byproduct is water itself, then there's a zero carbon emission energy source. So if you used carbon footprints, you would look at green hydrogen and go, that's the ultimate in sustainability. But what the carbon footprint doesn't capture is that you used a whole bunch of water to make that energy. And so I think water footprints are just a better mechanism to help people understand the actual choices and trade-offs that they're making when they're making energy decisions. One is that there are things like nuclear energy and hydroelectric production and hydrostatic production and green hydrogen that have a lot of benefits if you only conceive of sustainability in terms of climate change. But even if we had a magic wand that we could reverse and halt all the effects of climate change, that doesn't mean that all of our sustainability problems disappear. We've centered climate change in our conversation so much that it's starting to sound like it's the only environmental problem. And it's not the only environmental problem. There are other challenges that have nothing to do with climate change. And if we only focus on climate change mitigation, we may end up mitigating climate change, but causing a bunch of other problems. Now, maybe that trade-off ends up being worth it. I don't know that we can mitigate climate change without causing other problems, but at least we should have a metric that's telling us what the other problems are that we're creating. So I think that's why why water footprints are better than carbon footprints. I also think that it's just something people understand better. I still think that people understand the idea that, oh, something I really, really need to use got used up doing this other thing. People don't conceive of carbon that way. They don't think of it as, oh, I really need my daily carbon, but they do think that they need their daily water. So I think it's easier for people to understand a water footprint than it is a carbon footprint.
Especially I think a good way is like toilet paper uses
Right.
such an immense amount of water. And when you compare it to something like a bidet,
Right.
it's just it's such a huge shocking difference of water when you consider the footprints of it. So that's something to push instead of toilet paper. Maybe you mentioned that in your poop and pee.
That's a good one. Yeah.
You mentioned that addressing water security integrates concerns about rising energy demands. What innovative water management practices do you recommend for the clean hydrogen sector to minimize its water footprint, as well as ensure affordability in terms of production costs?
Well, I can think of a couple of ways in which the clean hydrogen sector can innovate in a policy way to sort of facilitate more sustainable water management as its production expands in the arid West. One is to our largest water consumer by far in the West is irrigated agriculture. And so if you're going to have new competitors for water coming into this region, the doors they have to knock are the doors of farmers. They're the ones who have and are using the water, and they are pretty smart. So they know how valuable their water is. And so you're going to have a hard conversation with them. Now, one of the things those farmers do, our farmers in Arizona are remarkably efficient and responsible when it comes to managing their water. But they need help sometimes to be able to make investments in infrastructure that facilitate greater gains. And so one thing that you might be able to see is partnering between the clean hydrogen sector and the agricultural sector to make investments in NDRIP and in center pivot, or even simple things like lowering the spray valve on sprinklers so that there's less water lost in the air and more water reaching the roots. There are simple, relatively small economic investments that can be made with farmers that will liberate more water. And one of the ways we can do that is to see loans made to farmers from industries like green hydrogen to be able to invest in greater efficiencies. And those loans would be secured by the water savings themselves, so that the people who are making the loans are betting on the water conservation, and the right and the security for that loan is the water, so that if they pay back, the farmers keep the water and then gain the efficiencies for everyone. If the farmers can't pay the loan back, then the security that ends up being given to industry is the water right, so that they're able to get their hands on the water, or at least play in the water market game. Another innovative approach that you're seeing some really interesting conversations about coming out of Stanford University is, what if we adapted the reverse auction model that we took with broadcast airwaves to the water sector? It's a surprisingly similar enterprise, at least in the sense that for decades and decades and decades, broadcast airwaves could be licensed out by the government. It was a public good that had scarcity, just like water. And so the government could license it out like water rights. And back in the olden days, they could license it out to, religious preachers, or to, Wayne and Garth in their basement in Wayne's World, to broadcast whatever fun thing they wanted to. But when cell phones came and the digital revolution came, the value of those airwaves went up. And so the question was, do you want these lower value airwave users to continue to occupy access to this broadcast spectrum, or do we want to get rid of them? It doesn't seem very fair to just boot them out. And so we can have a reverse auction that basically says who's willing to pay at this price to get kicked out of the game. We could do something similar to that with water. The same thing's happening in water right now. We've had decades of relatively low value water uses, at least in terms of economic production, of, growing alfalfa. And now these new major industries are coming in: semiconductor production, green hydrogen, microchip production, quantum computing, and they want to buy up this broadcast. Maybe the way to do it is through a reverse auction. Now, I want to caution that water isn't the same thing as broadcast rights. Water, you need it to stay alive. If Wayne and Garth get turned off TV, nobody dies. So we would have to structure this reverse auction differently, meaning that we would have to find ways that we're reserving a certain amount of water for certain uses in certain sectors. And we're going to have to be really upfront about the possible risks, which are, look, if big rich companies come in and in these reverse auctions are able to kick out a bunch of, relative to their economic value, low value water users, well, a lot of those low value water users were people who were growing, lettuce and making milk. And are you sure that you want the cost of lettuce and milk to go up so that your energy has a lower carbon footprint? People may need to have their eyes open to the reality of that potential trade-off.
Thank you for elaborating on those two innovative practices. I'd love to be able to learn more about those down the line, because they do sound very intriguing and very kind of, more of a unique way. We need all the ideas I think we can get when we're considering when we're talking about water policies in Arizona, because it's just so very complicated, and there's such a long, very complicated legal, a lot. I don't even know understand. I don't even know the first thing about the complexities of all those water rights when you talk about farmers and their entitlements. In light of your experience in legal water policy, how do you view Arizona's potential to balance domestic demands and export opportunities as it advances in clean hydrogen production? What water policies could support Arizona in becoming a major player in the clean hydrogen market while ensuring sustainable water use?
Well, it's an excellent question because it's something that Arizona is struggling with already. As you're seeing the controversy of, you know, everybody's screaming and yelling about these Saudi companies that are coming into Arizona and growing alfalfa using Arizona groundwater and then sending the alfalfa to Saudi Arabia to feed their dairy cows. And you're having people who are like, this is terrible. And every time I hear that, I want to ask them the question, why do you think it's terrible? Why does it matter that they're Saudis? Because domestic Arizona farmers grow alfalfa and sell it outside of the state of Arizona, or they use that alfalfa to feed cows that produce dairy that they sell outside of Arizona. There are Minnesota companies that buy up farmland in Arizona to grow alfalfa and then send that alfalfa to Minnesota dairies. But nobody's yelling about Minnesotans. So you have to ask yourself the question, why are you worried about Saudis? If what you're worried about is groundwater management, then it's irrelevant that they're from Saudi Arabia, right? Arizonans and Minnesotans grow alfalfa and ship it outside of Arizona. Is your concern that they're from Saudi Arabia? Why? Why? Is it because you don't like people from Saudi Arabia? Well, that's a stupid reason to oppose anything. Now, listen, I'm all for having a conversation about whether or not foreign national corporations should be able to buy up critical natural resources. That might be a national security conversation we have to have a conversation about, but has nothing to do with groundwater management. It's about national security. So if what we care about is groundwater management, then we just have to accept the fact that you can't go to people who grow things in Arizona and tell them they can't ship it outside of Arizona, because they're going to look at you and go, so wait a minute, let me get this straight. TSMC builds a giant microchip facility in Arizona and uses a whole bunch of water to make microchips and then sells those microchips all over the world. And everybody applauds and says, yay, commerce and international cooperation and free markets. But if I do the same thing with lettuce or oranges, I'm a bad guy and I'm unsustainable. We have to accept the fact that people are going to make stuff in Arizona, either agricultural products or technological products or energy sources, and that stuff's going to get shipped outside of Arizona. And telling those people to not ship it outside of Arizona is just telling them to make a lot less money, and they're going to oppose you because they're not stupid. So we need to have another conversation, which is, all right, if they're going to take a bunch of water, embed it into products, and then ship it outside of Arizona, how do we manage that so that it is somewhat sustainable? And part of that is going to be, we're going to have to more carefully manage some of our rural groundwater basins. And that's going to mean more recharge. It's going to be more grandfathered rights. It's going to be more restrictions on expansions of irrigation. And people are going to oppose that because they don't want to have their water rights managed. But I'm here to tell them, oppose that kind of management. And what's going to end up happening to you is your water rights are going to get valuable, and somebody richer than you is going to make a big offer to buy up that groundwater. And what's going to happen is farmers will walk away with a really big check in their pocket from semiconductors or green hydrogen companies. And everyone that's around those farming communities, the dry cleaner and the fertilizer salesman and the tractor repairman, they're going to be out of work. So if what you want to do is preserve agricultural economies, you better open your eyes to the need to manage those groundwater basins, because otherwise someone with a big thick wallet is going to make decisions for you.
Okay, thank you. In your chapter, Water Security and Armed Conflicts, you talk extensively about water disputes, even bringing up a situation that almost escalated into armed conflict with Arizona and California over a water dispute over allocation of the Colorado River Basin in 1922. So what legal mechanisms are in place to prevent these kinds of disputes now and into the future at our state and regional level, and potentially with Mexico? I know we've talked a little bit about Mexico before, but we're just going a little bit more into the dispute area of it.
Well, I'm not too worried about armed conflict, although knock on wood, right? You never know. But we have, in my experience, water is generally a catalyst for cooperation. It usually pulls people together and doesn't split them apart. There's a reason that our oldest civilizations grew up on the banks of the Nile and the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Indus. Desert rivers catalyze cooperation. But not always, just most of the time. And so sometimes they are sources of conflict, and we have to embrace that there's going to be competition, and competition can either be collaboratively managed or it can be managed through conflict. We've generally been pretty good in the Colorado River Basin at managing our conflicts through collaboration. I think the International Boundaries and Water Commission between the United States and Mexico has been a model for collaborative management. And a lot of that has been built on an adaptive regime that allows our treaties to adapt with these minute productions with two commissioners who have a really good relationship with each other, which allows for a very nimble regime. We haven't had that same kind of focused, nimble regime between our states. And so I think as we're looking at what the post-2026 world will be as we manage shortage in the Colorado River Basin, something that's more nimble and more adaptive is going to be needed. But I think the main thing that we have to focus on is the idea that rivers are circles, they aren't lines. And so when we look at a map, it's easy to look at a river and see it as this like crack, like a fracture that's moving through the land and that's splitting people apart. The better way to conceive of a river is as a basin. It's a circle that brings people together and surrounds us. And if we conceive of ourselves as not a bunch of different competing parties that are split by a river, but as one people united inside of the basin, it's an easier way for us to understand how we manage these things. And so any legal reforms need to move us in the direction of conceiving of ourselves as one river people rather than a bunch of different river people split by the river. And the problem with that is that in order to achieve that conception, you run into obstacles, understandable obstacles of sovereignty. That people don't want to conceive of themselves as the people of the Colorado River. They want to conceive of themselves as Californians and Arizonans and Navajo and Mexicans. And it's a hard obstacle to overcome to have them also conceive of themselves as the people of the Colorado River.
That's really, really, I've never thought of it that way before, whereas the river being a basin that unites people rather than a crack that separates them. That's really, really interesting. And when you talk about how it'll be easier when we all think of the river as a collective community, and that kind of goes into a little bit into the work of Eleanor Ostrom.
Yes.
I wrote a paper on that with their social ecological systems and how kind of her debunking the tragedy of the commons. So
right.
I think that goes hand in hand with if natural resources can be better managed when there's a community relationship with that natural resource, and we don't have to go down to this tragedy of the commons path. It's not inevitable. Mm-hmm. So A.Z. Kane frames its work in an interdisciplinary manner, working with energy experts, researchers, academics, government, and industry. How can interdisciplinary approaches to public policy enhance our ability to achieve water security within the state?
Well, water is inherently very interdisciplinary. So going back to your first question, I was very inspired early in my life that I was going to study water. And part of my rationale was, what if I just pick one small, simple problem and I spend my life trying to fix that small, simple problem, and then it'll have all these cascading effects to other more complicated problems. The problem is that young Rhett Larson didn't realize that water actually was as complicated or more complicated than racism and terrorism and a bunch of other things. And it was so interdisciplinary that it's difficult to get your mind around every aspect of the problem, and it can feel really overwhelming. And part of that is that, water is obviously a very technical issue. It's about science, it's about engineering, it's about hydrology and geology and toxicology and epidemiology and ecology. And it's obviously economic, right? Water is used in literally every part of our economy. But that's the challenge with water is everything that oil and coal and wheat is. It is a valuable, saleable commodity. But it's also everything that art and music and religion and family is. It is, we don't squirt each other with gasoline in the summertime, and we don't throw lumps of coal at each other in the wintertime, and nobody uses uranium in their religious ceremonies. It's just a different resource, and people feel about it differently. And our biggest challenge to water sustainability is not technical. We have the science and the engineering to map out a sustainable future. The real challenge is cultural, political, economic, is people are irrational about their water. And I don't mean irrational in a bad way. I mean irrational in a good way. They don't treat it in the same way that they treat a dollar bill. It means something to them, and they won't behave economically rationally about it. And it's a symbol of sovereignty, and they won't just give it up for money if it means something about who they think they are as a community. And so it's impossible for us to move forward in the water conversation if we don't take the people speaking technically and have them account for the cultural and political challenges. And one of the things I tell people all the time about water management is I have spent my whole career studying this. And after all this time, as a lawyer, I'm very comfortable in boardrooms and courtrooms. And after all this time, I'm reasonably comfortable talking to engineers and ecologists and economists. The place where I am uncomfortable, the place where I am baffled, is in legislatures. I don't understand what they're doing. I don't understand why they're doing it the way that they are. And so to me, the connection that I need to make, and that many of us in the water sector need to be able to make, is to do a better job integrating the politics of water and understanding why it's so hard to make water laws. So I think that's kind of where we need to expand. At least personally, it's where I need to expand to be a better water thinker, is to understand the politics of water inside of the legislative process.
I mean, that sounds immensely complicated if even you're having trouble wrapping your head around it. What role do you think academia can play in guiding a transition towards clean hydrogen production, particularly regarding water rights and access?
Well, academia, I think, spends probably too much time and probably too much money telling people things they already know or are already capable of reasonably guessing. So I've seen a lot of instances where you'll have a lot of academics get together and they'll do a lot of research and they'll spend a lot of money. And then at the end, their basic conclusion is being a poor minority is bad. Well, I mean, we didn't need to spend a bunch of money to know that. A really good example of this, and I hate to be critical of something that I'm sort of an outsider on, but there was the recent study that was done about garbage cans in New York. They spent $4 million, and come to find out, if you don't put your garbage on the street, but you put it inside of a garbage can, you get fewer rats. Well, duh. Of course you do. So I do think that academia needs to do a better job of prioritizing where it spends its time and money. And I'm not saying that it's not important to answer those questions, but some of those questions, all academia is doing is spending a lot of time and money to take something that we already had an 88% idea of and turning it into a 92% idea. And it's just that extra 4% isn't worth the time and the money. We'd be better off spending it somewhere else. And I think helping academia make the choice about how it's prioritizing its time and money means that they need to collaborate more with the decision makers on the ground, meaning that we need greater collaboration between the private sector and academia, and we need greater collaboration between academia and the decision makers in city and town councils and in mayor's offices and in the governor's offices and in the Department of Water Resources and the Department of Environmental Quality, to help them tell us, you have a whole bunch of really smart people who are devoted to solving a problem in a nonpartisan, unbiased way. And I tell people all the time, the price of expertise is interest. Nobody knows a lot about something and cares a little about it. And the best thing academia can be is it can be the one place in the world where people know a lot about something, but they don't have skin in the game any more than any other normal citizen can be. The place where I feel like I can do the most good as an academic is to say, I'm a water lawyer who has no client. I don't represent anyone in these water disputes, but I know the law. And I think it's important to have someone in that room who can say, I understand the complexities of this thing, but I don't have a side. And that's a rare thing in most disputes and in most management decisions. But the cost of having a bunch of people who don't have a side is that sometimes they're so disconnected from the problem that they spend all their time trying to tell people that turns out garbage cans are good at telling you that there'll be fewer rats. What they need to do is talk to the people who have a side and ask them, what are your priorities? Let's collaborate in helping me prioritize my time and my resources.
I think that's a really common criticism of academia. It's definitely one that holds a lot of weight. I absolutely agree that it needs to be less siloed, and there needs to be more collaboration to make sure that the research is as effective and important as it's possible to be. I also find it's also funny that you said that you're a lawyer without a client, because in one of your other books that you edited, there was a chapter on the personhood of rivers and how that could possibly potentially impact water laws in the future. And it's just a very interesting concept. I don't think we have a lot of time to get a ton into it, but I'm just wondering how likely you think it would be for rivers to be given personhood.
Well, I will.
Corporations have been given personhood, so.
Right. I will put my cards on the table on the personhood debate. And I will say this in all humility because I have a lot of very good friends and colleagues who are much smarter than I am and have written on this issue much better, and they disagree with me. I don't think rivers are people, and I don't think they should be people. And when I say that and somebody go, yes, but corporations are people, my response is, but corporations are people. They are. That's what they're made out of. Like, corporations are people just as much as religions are people and cities are people and environmental protection organizations are people. There's no such thing as a corporation that's not made out of people. And a corporation can speak and assert its own interests. It has an internal political process through which it can talk and express what it wants, just like a town or a church can. But rivers can't do that. They can't speak. And so it seems to me like if you're going to make a river a person with legal rights, you're going to have someone or some group of people speak for it. And that's a political choice. You're just going to decide that this person or this group of people are the voice of the river. And I can't fathom how that choice is going to be fair. Who gets to talk? And if the answer is the federal government, I mean, why are they so good at talking for rivers? They've botched that choice a whole bunch of times. The state government, why are they so good? Indigenous people. Well, if you say indigenous people, you don't know very much about indigenous people because they disagree internally and between themselves about how rivers should be managed. So you can't just pick one of them. So it seems to me like if rivers are going to be people, you're just going to be picking somebody through some political process who gets to talk for the river. And I don't agree with that. Also, it seems to me like you're sort of belittling the river. The river isn't a person. What's so great about being a person? A river's much closer to a god than it is to a person. And I think it's sort of silly for human beings to go, oh, the poor little vulnerable river needs our help because it's just like a little baby who needs a guardian. The river's laughing at us. It was there a billion years before us. It'll be there a billion years after us, and we are ticks on its back. And the better way to express the legal reality of the river is to tell human beings, you need the river. The river doesn't need you. When we're gone, it will clean itself up. It will tear down all of our dams, and it will be fine, and it won't even remember us. We need the river. We are its children. We don't protect the river because it needs our help. We protect the river because we need its help. And I think framing it as a person does it a disservice and sets us up like we are the protector of the river rather than the river is the protector of us.
That's definitely a really, really strong, I think, rebuttal argument against that. Definitely a subject that I'd love to learn more about. It's not super relevant. It's not the, I have a couple more questions I just want to finish off with. But thank you for that really interesting perspective on that definition of legal personhoods of rivers. How can public awareness and engagement be increased to support policies initiatives aimed at achieving water security?
Well, I can think of a couple of things. I might be partially influenced by the fact that we're in election season right now, but the choice to live in the desert is the choice to prioritize water. If you've decided to live in a desert, then guess what you just decided? You decided that your number one public policy priority is water. Because in the desert, it doesn't matter what policies you get right if you get water wrong. It doesn't matter if you have the best educational system and the nicest public transport system if you botch water policy in the desert. And I think part of that has to be reflected in our politics, meaning you shouldn't run for public office in this state, at least not a public office that's got some role to play in water, unless you are a water literate person. And you'd be surprised at how many elected positions are relevant to water. City council, town council, mayor, governor, corporation commission, county supervisor. These all have important water roles to play. And you shouldn't ever run for those offices if you aren't water literate. Now, here's the problem. A whole bunch of elected officials or people running for office would hear me say that and they'd go, but I'm okay because I'm super water literate. They almost all aren't. And so you need to have a very serious look in the mirror and go, do I know anything about this? And if I don't, I need to have the humility to sit and listen and learn. And citizens in Arizona need to demand that anyone running for public office in this state prove that they are water literate and that they can speak about these problems with nuance and understanding of the trade-offs. And so that's part of it is I think we need to make front water in our political conversations. And I also think that part of the challenge that we have right now is water has always been hyper political, but it's never been partisan. The divisions in water were never between Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and progressives. The divisions were between tribal and non-tribal, or rural and urban, or between agricultural sectors or industrial sectors. It didn't tend to be terribly relevant what political party you were in. I worry that partisan politics is starting to bleed into our water politics. And in fact, partisan politic conversations now sound more like water politics. Our conversations nationally and even in the state, they used to sound like a debate between progressives and conservatives. But that's not what our national politics sound like anymore. It sounds like water politics. It sounds like one group of people saying, you know, we live in big cities and we generate a lot of wealth and we have the most people and we have the most education and we live the most sustainably, so we should be in charge. And another group of people saying, we're the ones who grow your food and mine your metals, and it's your economic demands that are polluting everything, and it's not our operations. And you think that we're backwards, and you think that we're stupid, and you think that our values are wrong, and you think that just because you're richer and there's more of you that you can boss us around. And that used to be the conversation in water, and it's starting to sound like the general conversation. And so I worry that these divisions get in the way of our collaboration in water, and we can't allow that to happen. And part of that might be more investment in public education, even at the elementary school level. One thing I do with I've done in elementary school classes is I've played Hungry Hungry Hippo with kids, and we treat it like it's a river. And I help them learn about how if you just run up there first and gobble up all the marbles with your hippo, how in the long run you might have all the marbles, but if you're a cotton farmer and you gobbled up all of the marbles, but your town doesn't have any water and your school doesn't have any water and the river doesn't have any water and your neighbor doesn't have any water, you didn't really win. And so helping kids at a young age become water literate so that they can be these kind of leaders and these kind of engaged voters is an important way that we can invest our education dollars.
Thank you so much. We're at the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep you any longer. But just if you have any other issues or questions that you wanted to, if you have any questions for us or issues that you wanted to highlight, did you have anything that you wanted to bring up?
No questions other than I'm sure the big question outside of all these other questions people are going to ask you, which is why Arizona? And I mean, I know that that's, Arizona has a lot of, it's got a good workforce and it's got a lot of sunshine. But people are going to, why bring water intensive enterprises into Arizona? And that's the same conversation we're having about data centers and semiconductors and quantum computing, and the same conversation we're having about alfalfa farming, which is do we have water intensive operations in Arizona? And that's the question that people are going to have to answer. I tell people all the time, I'm a dad. I've got 4 kids. My oldest are, they're grown-ups now and are making big decisions. And one piece of advice I give my kids at that stage right now, as they're making big decisions about their future, is life isn't about having all of your dreams come true. It's about having the most important ones come true. And sometimes you have to give up some dreams to get other ones. I had a dream about having an avocado farm in the Dominican Republic and selling avocados, but I wouldn't have been able to marry your mom, or we wouldn't have been able to, so I had to give up some dreams in order to get other dreams. And that's where Arizona is with their water policy. There's nothing wrong with producing hydrogen. There's nothing wrong with making semiconductors. There's nothing wrong with growing alfalfa. There's nothing wrong with building homes. These are all good things. Nobody's a bad guy. But I don't know that we can do all of these things to the maximum extent. We're going to have to make some hard choices. And those hard choices will mean some people get hurt. And the least that we can do to those people is not lecture them like they're villains, right? Some people who grow crops in the past aren't going to grow those same crops. It doesn't do anybody any good to yell at them like they're the bad guys. They got hurt. Can we at least help them if they end up being the loser in this competition? And the problem is that Arizona water experts have this tendency to sort of pat people on the head and tell them this is all so complicated, you just don't understand. But the choice about what do we want to be when we grow up as a state is a choice we all have to make together. And water policy experts can't be the only ones that make that choice.
Thank you so much, Professor Larson. I had such a fantastic time talking with you. You had such amazing insights. There are a lot of really, really unique perspectives that I had not heard before. Really, you've given me so much to think about, so much to digest. And I really hope that I'll be able to speak with you again in the future. We'll do a continuation of this series, and it might be a little bit more structured and formal. This is in the future. Right now, we're kind of in the beginning of it, but I really, really appreciate your time. And I just learned so much from talking with you. And I'm just very, very impressed with the depth of your knowledge and the breadth of your passion for this subject. Like you said, you're not going to know a ton about a subject unless you're interested in it. And yeah, I can tell that this is a lifelong interest of yours and a passion. And it's definitely a great one, because this is one of the most important. I was saying that society, there's an argument to be made that energy is the most important thing, but I would argue that water is the most important thing, because 2 days without water and we don't have a civilization anymore.
Right.
2 days.
Right.
That's all it takes. We'll have civilization 2 days without electricity. We'll make it through, but without water, there's no hope.
Right.
So water is hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been my pleasure. Please consider me at your service anytime.